That's the Lumix GH6, one of Panasonic's biggest miscalculations. And because of that, one of the biggest bargains in the photo and video world. Most of you probably know this camera already. The GH5 was a true workhorse. It powered a huge part of the YouTube video boom a decade ago, and it earned Panasonic a massive amount of trust among videographers. And then the disaster happened. The GH6 delivered almost everything a semi-pro videographer could dream of, except face detect autofocus, and that omission was catastrophic. After years of building the public narrative that the GH5 would be nearly perfect if it just had reliable phase autofocus, Panasonic doubled down on contrast-based autofocus once again. Public opinion can shape the market in very harsh ways after such miscalculation, and because of that I ended up with what is essentially a top-tier cinema-oriented machine for less than $1,000 brand new. After the misguided premiere, GH6 became the only flagship camera of its generation, still relying solely on contrast autofocus. The GH7 and the S series now compete head-to-head with other brands, sometimes even leading technologically. But that recovery only made the GH6 feel even more obsolete, and its price collapsed. The GH6 was a fluke, but not because the rest of the specs were lacking. Quite the opposite. The specs were so outrageous for a Micro Four Thirds camera that people were angry they couldn't justify buying it simply because they needed autofocus for their work. The reality is that autofocus becomes less important as budgets go up, but it is extremely important for low-budget, one-man army productions that the GH line aimed at. If you've watched my previous videos, you already know I'm also a photographer working with analog medium format and occasionally Micro Four Thirds. So naturally I also tested the GH6 extensively for photography, with mixed results. To keep this introduction from dragging on, this video is my real-world review of the GH6 as a hybrid camera. So no sugarcoating the Micro Four Thirds ecosystem and no spec sheet reading. There are plenty of videos that already do that. And also in this case, the numbers for video are so good that they almost stop being relevant. Video resolution is excellent, even at high frame rates. I have open gate and anamorphic modes available, wave for monitoring for vlog, exceptionally high bit rates across pretty much all recording modes, full log format 10-bit 422, all boxes checked. On top of that, the sensor performs very well in moderate lighting conditions. Colors are solid, skin tones stay realistic even at higher ISOs, and the image holds together in a very predictable way. I'm not going to dive deep into color grading potential here, because if you're a high-end colorist, you will hate anything that isn't raw anyway. And in most real-world cases, if you need extreme grading on an interview or commercial job, the problem was probably lighting, not the codec. Let's also not forget that the GH5 with its vlog set a quality bar that Canon and Sony were trying to catch up to almost 10 years ago, not the other way around. So realistically, the video quality coming off this camera is so strong that you have to move into very specific niches, like near pitch black shooting, to make it look bad in comparisons. And of course, cherry-picking those scenarios is something we see all the time. Now let's talk about what really matters, how it actually feels to work with this camera. Obviously, that depends on the use case, so I will break this down by scenarios. And I will start with the most amateur one possible, using the GH6 as an all-round travel companion that in current age is all about video. I took it with me for a week to San Diego, California, and used it exactly the way a normal person would. Point and shoot whatever looked interesting. No cinematic prep, no staging, no lying on the ground to get the perfect mugshot of the dog. Just using it constantly during sunny days at night, changing settings all the time, relying only on autofocus and seeing how much that chaotic and professional usage would mess up the results. I've done similar trips and family-style shooting with Canon, Panasonic and Sony bodies, with very mixed results. To this day, I genuinely hate using older familiar Sony full-frame cameras in situations like this. Changing a single setting often meant standing in the middle of the street and googling where that option even lives in the menu. The G9, on the other hand, was one of the easiest cameras I've ever customized for this kind of work. And the GH6 is very similar. It has an insane number of options, but in practice you can quickly find the important settings, map them to physical buttons, and save full setups into custom modes tied to the dial. You often hear online that if you are a professional, you should know your camera inside out. Ironically, that statement usually reveals the opposite about you. In real professional environments, you often rent gear per project. It's completely normal to set up unfamiliar hardware from scratch at the start of every production day. If you work across different productions, you simply won't remember every setting on every camera. There are exceptions, of course. Weddings are a good example. For such cases, repetition makes owning and memorizing gear practical. But overall, most people, myself included, buy their own gear more for enjoyment than a strict professional necessity. And interestingly, it's usually amateurs who know their gear inside out. They spend a lot of time with it, they enjoy talking about it, and they are very active in online spaces. That creates a strong bias in discussions, because the loudest voices are often coming from people whose priorities and workflows are very different from real-world production environments. But let's go back to San Diego. Taking the GH6 on a vacation turned out to be a surprisingly harsh test. I had to optimize my workflow on the fly, and documenting a holiday trip is never easy. Anyone who's ever been the uncle with the camera knows that. I used these three lenses. Not an ideal travel setup, I would much rather avoid changing lenses altogether, but that made it a good test of how annoying lens swaps can be on this system. There are two important points here. First, all three lenses took up very little space in my backpack, simply because this is Micro Four Thirds. I would never be able to travel with three lenses of comparable quality on a full-frame system. This is one of the biggest strengths of Micro Four Thirds, and that brings us to the elephant in the room. The GH6 is not small at all. It's large, it's heavy, and it feels like a brick. Yes, the weight comes from the active cooling system, and yes, it's built like a tank. You could probably hammer nails with it. But for travel and vlogging, that weight crosses the line from solid into cumbersome. Of course, you can vlog with it, it's manageable. But for anyone with more fragile build, holding this camera on an extended arm with a vlogging handle is simply not realistic. It's also around 30% heavier than a full-frame Sony a7R4. Of course, full-frame setups can easily end up heavier because of the lens size, but that doesn't change the fact that the GH6 itself is not a travel-fast body. It is sealed, splash-proof, dust-proof, all of that, which is great, but you have to be ready to carry a serious weight. For vlogging, I use the Ulanzi TT38 tripod. It's great, it's affordable, but it's also on the heavy side. Also, the Lumix G Vario 12 to 35mm is impressively light, and overall that's roughly 1.5 kilograms held out in front of you. For comparison, an Osmo Pocket 3 weighs under 200 grams. Still, I have to say that GH6 has several features that are genuine lifesavers for vlogging and travel work. The front-facing record button is a small thing, but in practice it's incredibly welcome. The fully articulating screen that also pivots upward is another real quality of life improvement. But both the screen and the viewfinder are far from pro grade. But honestly, I can say exactly the same about every current flagship camera. Displays and EVFs in modern cameras are just bad across the board. I've talked about this in my previous video. One thing that really deserves emphasis in this run and gun scenarios is stabilization. Lumix IBIS in Micro Four Thirds cameras is insane. You almost forget how shaky your hands actually are. Let's be clear, it's a myth that you can get true gimbal-like movement purely from Lumix IBIS. In-body stabilization is not about simulating gimbal, but about maximizing number of keepers. Here, for example, you are seeing footage footage shot from a boat rocking on the waves. The movement looks calm, but the boat itself was anything but stable. This was recorded using serially anamorphic lens with no optical stabilization at all. What you are seeing here is purely IBIS. The GH6 even has a dedicated anamorphic stabilization mode that takes the squeeze ratio into account. Another small but important thing, the camera powers on very quickly. That sounds trivial, but in travel and vlogging situations it matters a lot. I've obviously used the GH6 extensively for my YouTube work as well, and there isn't much that's surprising here. This is a video-first flagship with a lot of professional features, so of course it gets the job done, as long as you don't rely too heavy on autofocus. The GH5 left a terrible legacy when it comes to autofocus pulsing in YouTube scenarios. So for a few videos I deliberately left the autofocus engaged to see how bad the situation really is after years of firmware updates. The problem is still there, but it's nowhere near as dramatic as internet discussions would suggest for a static talking head. But the moment you start moving or you just record yourself standing, that usually generates much more in-depth movement than sitting positions, and then, oh boy, you can forget about stable focus. On the other hand, if you have mainly your face in frame and you don't move, the focus is mostly on point. Small pulsing visible in background is common, but in most cases it isn't noticeable to an untrained eye, especially if you are not shooting everything wide open with the background completely obliterated. And once you add B-roll or a second camera angle for problematic fragments, it becomes almost a non-issue. The problem still exists, but it's simply very dependent on your use case. Is the GH6 good for YouTube? If your goal is to create visually strong, high-quality content, something closer to a cinematic production than casual vlogging, the GH6 is excellent. You are getting near cinema-grade video capabilities in a relatively compact body at a very low price. But if your YouTube content is mostly vlogging, selfies, or slice-of-life material, you won't benefit from most of this camera's professional features. And the body is simply too large and heavy for that kind of work. In that case, you are much better off with something smaller, lighter, and equipped with reliable autofocus like the Canon V50 or the Fuji X-M5. You will miss the stabilization though. Now let's move to another real-world scenario. This time I used a manual serial anamorphic lens in a run-and-gun behind-the-scenes shoot for a practice photo shoot organized in my studio. It was a full day of work, multiple setups, analog and digital photography. In fact, it's very similar to previous scenarios, but with additional constraints. We've got here highly contrasty scenes, very low light backstage. It's all about constantly changing positions to get good angles, while showing everyone in team and not getting in anyone's way at the same time. Creating high-quality BTS content without dedicated time slots and without disturbing the production flow is difficult, and frankly, it's not something I'm good at. But that's exactly why this is such a good stress test for the hardware. In conditions like that, the last thing you want to fight is the camera itself, and this is where the GH6 really shines. Excellent stabilization, proper anamorphic support, strong manual focus assist tools, and in this case the heavier body actually helps. It improves handling and stabilization once you mount a long heavy lens. What you are seeing here is footage shot with minimal global color grading, recorded at ISOs up to 6400. And when you realize that this entire rig costs around $1,300 US, it really makes you question why we so casually accept 4,000 plus prices for new full-frame bodies. However, there's another feature that's often overlooked in these discussions: open gate recording. Anyone who delivers content in both horizontal and vertical formats knows how valuable open gate can be. And for content creators, that's a real quality of life feature. You can record internally in ProRes HQ, and if you need more flexibility, the HDMI output supports RAW recording. Both, in most cases, are overkill, but you can hardly find any other camera with such possibilities for $1,000. Now, what about photo quality? This is where things are a bit more nuanced. It's not the best in class. But it's absolutely solid, and here context matters a lot. The GH5 was genuinely bad for photography, not because Micro Four Thirds is bad for photos, but because that particular sensor and processing pipeline were clearly designed for video. At the same time, Panasonic had the G9, a photo-first camera with a different sensor, different processing and autofocus that actually worked well for stills, as long as you weren't shooting extreme action. I own the G9 and did many photo sessions with it, and to this day it's one of the most ergonomic and pleasant cameras I've ever used. The images were good enough that I've genuinely misled viewers into thinking they were shot in a medium format. Also, I am currently recording this very video on my G9. That said, the G9 shot 12-bit RAWs, and because Micro Four Thirds usually captures less total light than full frame, you could feel colors starting to fall apart when pushing low, moody exposures in post. And I have to say that I didn't feel that at all with the GH6. This camera arrived in the era of true hybrid shooters, where every camera is expected to be good at both video and photo, and unlike the GH5, it didn't have a separate photo-oriented sibling. Panasonic clearly put everything they had into this one body. Now, let's be realistic. This is still not a stacked top-tier flagship sensor. Compared to current generation flagships, you can feel the difference of maybe 1 or 2 stops and some loss of color depth in deep shadows when working with RAWs. But unless you are doing product-critical, high-end professional photography, the kind where $20,000 systems are the starting point, this simply isn't a real limitation. Of course, I had to put this camera through a much more demanding test than studio photos. And I did. I shot nearly 10 sessions during a sailing trip in Croatia. We are talking 100% handheld, mostly in harsh full sun, no reflectors, none of the usual pro set luxuries. Sometimes both the model and I were moving on a rocking boat. It was a brutal test for both the autofocus and the stabilization system. Let's start with the IBIS, because there are no illusions here. It is incredible. This might be the best in-body image stabilization ever. It does not fail. You can drop your shutter speed to absurdly low levels for static scenes and get the tack-sharp results. As for the autofocus, when there's no movement, it is fast and locks perfect focus without breaking a sweat. The face and eye tracking is surprisingly close to current full-frame flagships, and it manages to detect faces and objects even when cranked up to high ISOs. But because it uses Panasonic's contrast-based DFD system, it pulses. Watching that pulsing in the viewfinder, I constantly felt like the camera hadn't locked focus before I heard the shutter click. Thankfully, it was mostly an illusion, and the vast majority of the shots were totally nailed. Because contrast-based autofocus relies on this pulsing motion to find focus, tuning it feels practically impossible. Switching it from single-shot autofocus to continuous tracking didn't seem to change my miss rate at all, even though single shot felt like it missed more often. And the way depth of field interacts with this autofocus system is super counterintuitive. Your brain tells you that stepping down your aperture and using a wide lens will give you a massive depth of field, so you should naturally get more keepers, right? Wrong. Contrast-based autofocus needs clear contrast differences in the frame for that pulsing to work. So strangely enough, having too much depth of field makes it harder for the camera to focus. I know all this makes the autofocus sound pretty bad, but it's really not. We are talking about few percent miss rate in an incredibly tough conditions in burst mode. It is not far from the competition. So this camera is more than capable for any level of amateur photography, and you could confidently bring it to most professional sets. Just maybe don't buy it if you are a dedicated sports photographer. You really see that limitation when using a flash in TTL mode. Sometimes it grabs focus blazingly fast, and other times it is fighting for its life. To wrap up the photo side, the dynamic range is solid, the splash-proof body is a lifesaver in the field, and let's not forget the native Micro Four Thirds sensor format, which gives you that beautiful 6:4:5 medium format aspect ratio. It's an absolutely fantastic ratio for photography and was considered a gold standard in professional space way before consumer grade cameras hit the shelves. Plus, if you shoot product photography, the high-res mode works wonders, and you have a solid set of bracketing options built right in. This is something that Lumix users are just used to, and they are in shock when they realize that, for instance, Sony a7R4, a high-res studio monster that is used professionally for product photography, doesn't even have focus bracketing. We've already touched on the weight, but honestly that matters even more when you are shooting photos. The body is bulky, and that bulk doesn't exactly translate into better ergonomics. The older G9, which was clearly built as a photo-first camera, felt noticeably better in the hand. That said, the GH6 still handles better than most Sony and Fujifilm bodies, but because it's a video-first hybrid, there are quite a few minor quirks. For example, the EVF eye cap doesn't fit the face all that well. The fully articulating screen sticks out and likes to bump against your cheek while you are shooting. And the joystick, it feels pretty cheap and unresponsive. It's definitely a downgrade from the G9. It feels like Panasonic just chipped out here. But honestly, the fact that I'm nitpicking these tiny details really says a lot about how good this camera body actually is. And speaking of the body, let's talk physical controls, because the GH6 is absolutely loaded. You've got 3 buttons right beside the shutter, 2 custom buttons next to the lens, a dedicated lock lever, and a full set of 3 dial rings on top of a ton of other physical buttons. There's even a locking button on the mode dial. Panasonic gave these buttons different depths and textures. You don't just learn where they are, you build muscle memory by feeling them. Once you get used to an extensive setup like that, it's honestly hard to switch to any other flagship. I did a lot of static photography with fully analog cameras. Basically, I'm used to having a camera that have only one button, a shutter. But the GH6 is especially nice for analog lovers because the manual focus punching works wonders. At the end of the day, the GH6 is just a fun, incredibly capable machine, and at its current price, it's a total bargain. It has features that punch way above its weight class. I mean, getting world-class IBIS and uncropped 4K 120p at this price point is almost unheard of. The GH6 is a jack of all trades, well, except for that autofocus. On the other hand, prices for the next generation of Micro Four Thirds cameras are already starting to drop. You could argue it's worth saving a few $100s more for the G9 Mark II, or even jumping ship to a Lumix S-series full-frame body, which is really on the rise right now. Of course, moving to full-frame body isn't just about the body, it is about replacing your entire lens collection. So if you are looking to jump into the Micro Four Thirds world, I would say wait and see, because the L-mount ecosystem is looking better every day. But either way, whether you are upgrading from a GH5 or an old G9, or just want to see what a Micro Four Thirds is all about, it's a camera that's hard not to enjoy. That's all for today. Don't forget to subscribe, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.